New hospitals, old facilities being repurposed. Why the next 2 weeks will be critical for Canada. New details on the federal wage subsidy, which businesses are eligible, when they'll get help, and who is still waiting. Mounting tales of heartbreak.
She died alone. We didn't even get to say bye to her.
Plus toughening measures across the U.S. An evolving debate, is it worth wearing a face mask in public? And the detective work of contact tracing. It is vital, plus Canadian researchers racing to find treatments.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Wartime language is now being used to describe the fight against COVID-19, an invisible enemy that has changed all our lives. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau calls it the greatest economic and health challenge since the Second World War. And the emergency aid plan being rolled out for individuals and businesses is the largest in Canadian history. The Prime Minister says it is the duty of every Canadian to do their part.
Listening to public health rules is your duty. Staying home is your way to serve.
There are new details about the $71 billion wage subsidy to help businesses keep employees on the payroll. We'll get to that in just a moment, but first the numbers that everyone is watching. There are now close to 1 million people around the world who are known to have the virus. 70,000 new cases today alone. Here in Canada, nearly 10,000 people have now tested positive. That's an increase of more than 1,100 over yesterday. Several provinces saw a steep rise in new cases today. Ontario reported 426 positive tests. That's double the number of new cases reported yesterday. Manitoba had 24 new cases. That is more than triple the previous day. And Quebec had 449 new cases. That's a big number, but it's actually down quite a bit from yesterday when the province confirmed 732 new cases, its highest single-day total. Those numbers don't paint the full picture. We know not everyone with symptoms is being tested. We know there's a backlog of tests and there's a lag time in getting results. And just because you haven't heard about cases in your community does not mean they don't exist. April promises a new wave of infections. And as Eric Sorensen reports, new facilities are already being built for the coming surge.
It's an ominous sight. Urgent construction of an instant addition to the Joseph Brant Hospital in Burlington, west of Toronto. It will house more than 90 new beds for a surge of COVID-19 patients expected soon. So far, many cases in the country have occurred in clusters. In Calgary, 4 residents of the Mackenzie Town Continuing Care Centre have died. There and across the country, outbreaks have revealed the vulnerability of seniors' homes. Even family must stay away. It's sad, says Quebec's Premier, but it's a question of life and death. But so far, Canada as a whole has fared well.
For the month of March, the single biggest surge was in Quebec about a week ago when the numbers shot up towards 4,000. That's largely explained by travelers coming back after the early March break and other trips. Now, Ontario also began to surge up towards 2,000, not as many as you might expect for the biggest province, but then Ontario has lagged behind in testing. For B.C. and Alberta, they did a lot of early testing, and their numbers have flattened out ever so slightly, a hopeful sign. Now, we bring those 4,000 number down to 200, and that's where the other provinces are, below that number. Saskatchewan has the highest number, but then Saskatchewan did a lot of testing. For the rest of those provinces, a steady rise for Nova Scotia, Manitoba, New Brunswick, even PEI. The one that stands out here is Newfoundland and Labrador. It is a smaller province, but it has the highest per capita number of cases in any province except for Quebec. And then finally, the Northern Territories, and luckily, up in the north, the numbers are still relatively low.
But, say experts, April will test our resolve as a country.
We're now in the thick of it, and this is going to be going on for several weeks.
The virus is spreading. An outbreak among temporary foreign workers at Byland Nurseries in West Kelowna, B.C. 14 tested positive initially. They're exempt from travel restrictions, deemed essential workers in Canadian agriculture.
Any place where people have to be tightly placed together for sleeping purposes, for eating purposes, for accommodations, then you increase the risk.
New facilities are being built or repurposed. The Convention Centre in Vancouver, the former Hôtel Dieu Hospital in Montreal, and the rush to put up that new field hospital in Burlington, Ontario. facilities that may be needed as soon as they're ready. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
Part of the pandemic planning is what happens when it's over and how businesses that are on life support now can bounce back to full production quickly. That's what the federal wage subsidy is supposed to do. Businesses are desperate for details on how it will work, and today we got some. Our chief political correspondent, David Akin, is taking us through them. David.
Well, Donna, in its basic conception, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy sounds pretty straightforward.
Is that it's going to be available for businesses, big and small, that are not publicly funded and have seen a 30% or more decline in gross revenues. That includes everything from bars and restaurants to charities and nonprofits.
But then there's the details. The biggest one, when will this wage subsidy be paid? Answer, it will take 3 to 6 weeks. Businesses will get this subsidy from the Canada Revenue Agency and will have to show that their monthly revenue this year dropped by at least 30% compared to the same period last year. But what about those businesses that cannot make that comparison? A startup, for instance, that might have just started earning revenue this year, or a business that might operate on such thin profit margins that loss of revenue of even 5% could mean collapse.
For a business that's just started up in the last year, we're working on how to deal with that. One way would be that they show us the previous month's revenue and show that the decline has happened. But we will have details on that situation and other situations in the coming days.
The cost of this wage subsidy program will also be huge, an estimated $71 billion. That's about 3 times what the government spends on national defense in a year. And for a program that big, Parliament will have to approve.
This is the largest economic program in Canada's history. So I've asked the House Leader and the Deputy Minister to reach out to the other parties about bringing back Parliament. This must be a Team Canada effort.
Now, I'm not understating when I say business owners have been frantic to get the details of this program. I must have heard from a dozen of them today. Their biggest worry now is how to stay in business until this wage subsidy program kicks in, and that could be the middle of May. Donna?
All right, David Akin in Ottawa, thank you. There's also new detail about the second federal program being rolled out for people no longer getting a paycheck because of COVID-19. It's called the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. Applications open on April 6. If you select direct deposit, you should, we're told, receive pay within 3 to 5 days. If you opt for a check in the mail, you should get it within 10 days. The benefit will provide about $2,000 a month to those who have lost pay and will be available for 4 months. It is for those who do not qualify for employment insurance. Canadians who are already receiving EI benefits will continue to receive them and should not apply for the CERB. And here's a number. 2.1 million Canadians have applied for EI in the last 2 weeks. Well, we've talked about how bad things are economically in Alberta, but Newfoundland and Labrador is worse. That province is so short of cash, the Premier did something extraordinary. He wrote to the Prime Minister pleading for help, warning the province is out of time. Finances were bad before this pandemic, but now, as Ross Lord reports, Newfoundland and Labrador is on the brink of disaster.
This Newfoundland oil refinery is halting production due to COVID-19. Oil prices have plummeted, sinking the market for jet fuel and propane, 2 of the refinery's main products.
It's going to take about 5 days to shut it down safely. It'll be an idle mode. It could be 2 months, up to 5 months.
Newfoundland and Labrador's problems run much deeper. Its operating deficit and overall debt were already the highest per capita in Canada. After the pandemic hit, finances became so desperate, Premier Dwight Ball wrote to the Prime Minister, saying without federal assistance, the province would be unable to pay its bills. The letter said, "We have no other recourse to raise the necessary funds to maintain the operations of government." Ball added, "Our province has run out of time." Support from the Bank of Canada allowed the provincial government to hold an emergency session of the House of Assembly and borrow $2 billion. At the time, the Premier brushed off the crisis.
Can you cover payroll without that loan?
We can. There's no question the province is in a very difficult situation, but we'll be covering payroll.
Now, his plea to the Prime Minister is public.
It's really just expressing where we as a province, where I would see it going, and the need for the federal government to look at Newfoundland and Labrador as a unique province.
Ball suggests his province will need much more financial help after Canada emerges from the pandemic. Ross Lord, Global News.
In Quebec, the Premier is so concerned about the pandemic, he's expanded the province's travel restrictions to 4 more regions today. There are now police checks on the bridges that connect Ottawa and Gatineau in Quebec. It's to stop people potentially infected with COVID-19 from entering the province. Anyone trying to enter Quebec who isn't an essential worker may be forced to turn around. More than 270 million Americans have been ordered to stay home and limit their movements. And Kentucky is now putting ankle bracelets on some infected people who refuse to stay home. But the restrictions are not nationwide. The rules vary, and in some places it seems it's too late. Confirmed cases keep soaring. There are more than 211,000 in the U.S. now, a jump of 22,000 today. And more than 4,700 people are known to have died. The real number is certain to be higher because we know people in places like New York City are dying in their homes, and even in hospitals, people are dying in such numbers it's hard to keep an accurate tally. Jackson Prosco reports.
They are lives cut short by the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. James Goodrich, a renowned neurosurgeon who separated conjoined twins. 60-year-old Sharon Seiler, a California woman with no underlying health problems. 3 members of the Conkey family in Ohio. The grandmother of New Yorker Robert Luger.
My grandmother died alone. She died alone. We didn't even get to say bye to her.
In hospitals across the U.S., they're preparing for many more grim days as doctors and nurses face tough decisions about who they're able to treat.
Well, nearly everybody coming to the emergency department has this, and we're getting completely overwhelmed.
It's predicted COVID-19 will kill at least 100,000 Americans in the coming months, with deaths and confirmed cases climbing rapidly by the day. That brutal reality has forced even the most reluctant to act. Florida's governor, who refused to break up the party over spring break, bowed to pressure and issued a stay-at-home order. There are already 7,000 cases in the state.
Even though there's a lot of places in Florida that have very low infection rates, it makes sense to make this move now.
New York took more drastic steps, closing overcrowded playgrounds after families refused to keep their distance.
Who else has to die for you to understand you have a responsibility in this?
Nearly 85% of Americans are under orders to only leave home for essential reasons. But for thousands of grieving families, it's simply too little, too late.
The U.S. government's emergency stockpile of masks, gowns, and gloves is dangerously close to being depleted. Officials say it was never meant to confront a 50-state pandemic, and they're having a hard time restocking it. At the same time, the U.S. government is said to be preparing an order for 100,000 body bags. Donna?
Jackson Prosco in Washington, thanks. Is wearing a face mask in public worth it? Coming up, we'll dive into the debate. We know what works to protect us from this virus, staying physically distant, staying home, and washing our hands. But what about wearing face masks in public? We know the medical grade ones, the N95 masks, are in short supply and they must be saved for frontline workers. But what about more basic ones, even homemade masks? As Mike Armstrong reports, the thinking on that is evolving.
It isn't that there are a lot of masks in Austria, they're almost everywhere. In fact, as of next week, by law, they'll be mandatory in all grocery stores. This probably should have been introduced from the start, this woman says. There are already 2 European countries forcing people to wear masks. This is the recent swearing in of the new government in Slovakia. In the neighboring Czech Republic, there's also a movement to spread the idea globally.
Everyone.
Of masks for all.
I know. They maybe told you that masks wouldn't protect you, but there are studies proving that even a homemade mask can be partially protective. Partially. Any protection is essential today.
Now, the conclusions in the studies range from masks being a last resort to suggesting they should be a part of a pandemic response. In fact, even homemade masks worn by everyone could help slow transmission. Several Asian countries where mask use is already common have had more success controlling COVID-19.
In South Korea, they had their first deaths about the same time as Italy. Their deaths are now about 100 times less. And they have the magic recipe of 4 things: testing, tracing, quarantine, and universal mask wearing.
So far, there is no appeal for the Canadian public to wear masks. Governments right now are focused on the critical shortage of N95 masks.
We do need to protect medical masks for medical professionals and other frontline workers.
Now, there are questions about whether the public would use masks properly, but the U.S. Centers for Disease Control is already considering asking people to cover their faces in public. And at this Toronto hospital, there's an appeal out for homemade masks. They want to distribute them in the neighborhood to anyone who comes within 6 feet of others. The goal isn't only to protect the wearer, but the people around them as well.
I protect you, you protect me.
Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
Tracking COVID-19 still ahead is Canada keeping up with contact tracing. We keep talking about the number of people tested for this virus, but what's just as important is something called contact tracing, the painstaking, detective-like work that public health workers do to trace every single person someone with COVID-19 came into contact with. Those contacts need to be assessed and isolated to break the chain of transmission. As Jeff Semple explains, there is growing concern Canada is not keeping up.
So I never thought in 1,000 years that I would get this.
Emilio Merritt just got home from the hospital. The Vancouver actor has asthma, so when he started feeling sick last month, he assumed that's what it was.
And then I started having a pain in the chest, and then I tried to breathe, and I can't.
On March 21st, he tested positive for COVID-19. His symptoms had first appeared on March 13th. And during that week in between, he says he'd mostly been at home, besides running a couple of errands. BC health officials asked for a list of all of his contacts.
And then I told her what I've been doing, went to the gas station, and then went to shopping. So probably she called everyone from the places I've been.
Public health officials did tell Merritt's housemates to self-isolate, but that gas station he'd visited says they'd never received any call and had no idea a COVID-19 patient had been there.
We could probably do more when it comes to tracing the confirmed patients and making sure that all those who had contact are isolated and tested.
Dr. Tina Park points to South Korea, which has received international acclaim for flattening its curve, conducting more tests per capita than any country. When a case is confirmed, officials retrace their steps using satellite, credit card, and smartphone data. Then they send alerts to anyone who may have had contact.
Contact tracing is rather controversial because of concerns about privacy and individual data.
To appease those privacy concerns, this Montreal company is developing an app that allows users to decide whether to share their location and receive alerts.
You would be informed on your personal phone that over the course of the last, let's say, 14 days, you've been in contact with someone who has tested positive. Of course, that would be completely anonymous.
The app should be ready in a few weeks, but it'll be up to Canadians and their governments to decide whether to use it. Jeff Semple, Global News, Toronto.
Prince Charles is speaking out after recovering from COVID-19.
As we're all learning, this is a strange, frustrating and often distressing experience.
The 71-year-old is in good health. He remains in Scotland. He only displayed mild symptoms, and his wife, the Duchess of Cornwall, has tested negative for the virus. Next, the latest developments on finding a treatment for COVID-19. There is no approved treatment for this virus, but labs all over the world are working to develop some. Clinical trials are underway, and the American Federal Drug Administration has approved the use of 2 anti-malarial drugs, even though they are unproven. It's hoped the possible benefits will outweigh the risks. Heather Urix-West on the race to find a treatment.
Hydroxychloroquine has been used for years to protect people from the devastating impacts of malaria. Researchers believe it could help protect against COVID-19 as well.
There's some data to suggest that if you're taking hydroxychloroquine and you're exposed to the virus, that the infection won't take hold.
The evidence behind it comes from the fact that it's able to inhibit the
replication of this virus in a cell culture, which means in a laboratory, but we don't have any evidence that this works at all in people, which is why we need to do this trial.
Patients across Manitoba, Quebec, and Alberta are now being enrolled in the international clinical trial, one of several studies currently underway in this country as researchers search for a treatment that works.
We have no therapies for COVID-19 specifically outside of high-quality hospital care. And so that's the hope, that we all collaborate and coordinate, that we learn as much as possible, as fast as possible.
The HIV drug lopinavir remdesivir is another medication being studied. Several provinces, including B.C. and Ontario, have launched clinical trials involving patients vulnerable to the disease.
We're starting some trials in care homes where if you are exposed, you get randomized to either a medication or not, and seeing if you get infection in the end.
Convalescent plasma is being looked at carefully as well. This comes from the donated blood of patients who have already recovered from COVID-19. A hospital in Texas began the first North American trial for this therapy last weekend. A Canadian trial expected to involve 1,000 patients will likely start in about a month. The science is moving very quickly because the virus is moving fast too. Researchers hope to know soon what therapies work and which ones don't. Heather, Your Express Global News, Calgary.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Donna Friesen. We leave you tonight with another reminder all of us, all over the world, are in this together. This is Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza, lit up with a message we can all get behind. Stay home, stay safe, and thank you to those keeping us safe. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.